Hello, hello, and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with No Bard. Today, we continue the trek to beat Metroid Prime 3 on Hypermode. And all honesty, today is going to be a little bit of a, shall I say, smaller video. It's not going to be the hour and a half that the introduction to this mini-series was ended up being. Today, I want to focus a little bit on two aspects of the game. The first is none other than the Frost Lord himself, Rundas. Now, Rundas, I have mentioned in the past, and I think is pretty obvious at this point, is my favorite of the hunters. And I think that's a pretty common belief among the individuals who have played the game. Of the three hunters that Samus gets to interact with throughout the duration of Metroid Prime 3, Rundas is the biggest impact. You have Gore, who shows up briefly prior to getting the mission briefing. You have Gandreda, who's seen messing around with just life in general and trying to imitate Samus. And you have the overly serious Rundas. And I personally love this aspect of the character. He wasn't necessarily meant to be a long-standing character, but he was one that had a very significant role to play in the form of a confidant. Now, I have mentioned that I believe that Rundas sees himself as Samus's equal. I don't believe that very many people would argue against the statement. But what I believe sets him apart are the different interactions we get with him. They're small in number, only about 5 times in the game. And that's being generous, if I'm being honest. Rundas shows up right at the beginning of the game. He immediately gives the mission briefing of what they're expecting, passes off information on ship orders and command modules for their ships, proceeds to save Samus from a raid of space pirates, proceeds to save Samus from a dragon, aka Ridley, on their first encounter with the beastie, and if that wasn't enough, still had enough time to turn on one of the other generators. And this is an impressive situation. Rundas, as a boss, however, is not quite himself. And he's one of the characters that I believe has probably one of the most unique boss fights. He is, for all intents and purposes, a stronger adversary for Samus than virtually any other enemy to this point. And I would argue, up until battling possibly the seed boss of this area. Rundas is a hunter that uses ice-based or frost kinesis to be able to travel, and the bulk of his capabilities are tied to the generation and control of ice-based creations. And in and of itself, this ability is absolutely absurd. But it's not his only ability. And this is something that I believe is important. Not only does he have the capability to coat his opponents in ice, change the landscape, create projectiles, but he can also create armor. The phase-on aspect of his new found abilities isn't exactly much. More of a power boost to be able to do more with his capabilities. But it doesn't really affect him in the way that I would like to have seen. However, as far as Rundas goes, I believe that he is far and away the biggest influence on Samus for the duration of the game. And to kind of emphasize my point, the other hunters have a role, but Rundas is the only one that I genuinely fear stepping into a battle. Going back as far as I remember playing the game as in 2011-ish for the first time, Rundas was the one that I felt the most attachment to. I believe that in a way he ended up being a little bit of a wasted potential character. There was so much I wanted to see from this character that just never panned out or was never explored. And part of this is simply due to the fact that he was meant to be an early game boss. That didn't exactly go to plan. Anyways, as we were, the nature of him being an early game boss and being as far into his corruption as he was, is there really isn't all that much that's still holding him together. He doesn't speak, he doesn't interact, he attacks, and quite violently, I will add. He is intending on effectively saving his life for whatever that ends up being. Okay, so he's down. What in the... Alright, anyways. His whole power system is designed for this area. His mentality, his character development, for as short as it was incredible and showed a relatively unique character for so early into the game. And I would be amiss to say that he wasn't a favorite right from the get-go. But the biggest issue with Rundas is the time we get with him, or rather the lack thereof. He is far more potent than I believe almost any other character in the franchise was. But this moment, a lot of people either see as one of two things. A loss of control of his power, or temporarily regaining his mind. Whichever side of that you fall on, one thing is it remains the same, that he died not by Samus's strength, but by his own power. And Dark Samus claims the first of the hunters. In his wake, in what he leaves behind, is just a fragment of his power, the ice missiles. The ice missiles allow me to create, or rather allow Samus, to freeze most liquids, including fuel gel, most enemies, and genuinely is one of the more versatile capabilities that she gets her hands on throughout the duration of the game. And this isn't the only one of Samus's abilities that are influenced by her companions. But I want to take a little bit of a step back and focus more so on the planet itself. Bryo was at one point a paradise. It was meant to be something brighter, meant to be the home of the reptillian race. And I don't believe that they necessarily did it wrong by any means, but rather that the reptilian race that we see across Bryo is meant to be I suppose, similar in many ways to the Chozo. They originally came to Bryo after being a spacefaring race, much like the Chozo as well as the Luminoth. where the Chosen and the Luminoth found a harmony between the new and old ways, tradition and technology. The bryyonians, or the reptillians, did not, often reaching a point of arguing amongst one another.
This generator is supplying power to the Leviathan's protective shield. You will be unable to destroy the generator with your current weapons. You must find a weapon capable of penetrating the generator's heavy armor.
Anyway, the Age of Science was brought on shortly after they had consistently, or found a means of consistent space travel. And the Bryyonians had an issue where they were dealing with two sides of the same coin, so to speak. One side wanted nothing more than science to rule their entire planet. The other wanted for their traditions to continue. The pair ultimately were arguing for a while, and the Chozo went as far as to say, find a way to meld your new and old ways. By seeking just one or the other, you will sow the seeds of discourse, and it will not be pretty. The reptilians that were effectively the purveyors of the science side of things refused to budge on their stand, actually renouncing the old ways in its entirety, believing that they were in the right and the superior side. And it didn't go well. The reptilians that were of traditionalists, shall we say, all fought back as they believed that it was their right to fight back, and their traditions mattered more than science. The ones that were more science-minded created the Mogonars, stone golems capable of, well, doing virtually anything that the creators so pleased, being one of the few enemies that actually gives Samus a run for her money in the early stage of the game. The Mogonars are technology that acted as both a sword and shield, so to speak. Golems that could fight on their behalf. This sparked, I suppose, a civil war between the pair, where the old ways, though those that deemed magic as a possibility, were, what was it called? They ended up getting the title of the Primals. And so, the Primals fought back. This civil war was incredibly one-sided. The science-minded, specific, what were they called again? The ones that were more involved in the science, being the Lords of Science, they were winning the war, thanks to their creation of the Mogonars. However, they also saw a toxicity brewing, something that they hadn't accounted for in their initial plans and creation of their various tech across the world. This new problem that arose was going to tear the planet apart, ultimately making it uninhabitable for either side. They sought a means of purifying the air, the water, the land as a whole, so as to prolong the lifespan of Bryo. However, this caused the Primals to have something to latch onto, something to look for. In the initial massacre, the initial fight between these two powers, the Primals ended up losing. The Primals ended up losing it in the initial battle. But the later battles that came saw the Lords of Science fall one after another. Ultimately, they did manage to secure a means of protecting their entire planet. But what remained was primarily wasteland. It was primarily wasteland, primarily destroyed ancient, primarily destroyed architecture, primarily dust and debris. There was nothing left of the Brio that they knew prior. The Brio that was left behind for the Primals after the end of the war ended up with 48% of the planet being uninhabitable because of being steered towards the sun. 48 being uninhabitable due to being too cold. And 4% being a belt of vegetation, if scrawny and falling apart. Now, after the war, the reptilians that remained were all primals and sought to avoid the use of the technology that had preceded them. This means that the Mogonars that are strewn about are simply left over from the days of old, shall we say. The goal being that each of the Mogonars could theoretically still run, but they required a fuel source that generally the Lords of Science used rather sparingly at best, and the Primals renounced, that being fuel jet. So where does this all lead us? The Lords of Science are gone, the Primals have no interest in technology, and so the general intelligence of the species as a whole regressed to a point of losing any form of space travel. Their planet was more or less destroyed, and to make matters far worse, they really had nothing left to show for it either. After the events that transpire the early game, this being the first interaction with Phazon, the fall of the Leviathan Sea, most of the species within Brio are much more, shall we say, irritable and angry, much more willing to fight than they were prior. This is consistent with what we know about Phazon as a whole. But what I think the real big kicker for this situation is that the Bryyonians were actually somewhat resistant to the Phazon corruption. Although the reptilian race that is the predominant race on Brio did end up with some rather glaring concerns when it came to their intelligence and how well they kept their minds, physically speaking, not much changed. So it is, I suppose, worth noting as a whole. Anywho, at the moment, we are tackling getting to a old Federation, I suppose I would call it not a colony, but a old Federation outpost, used in two major ways. The first being that it was used for the maintenance and upgrading their ships, which I think is a pretty fair thing to have on a place like Brio. So we're going to break in and upgrade the ship with missile systems. The goal of having the missile systems is not to be an overpowering force, but rather to allow for the destruction of the shield surrounding the the Leviathan seed. With the seed out of the way, or with the shield out of the way, we can enter the Leviathan seed and finish the job. in some capacity at the very least. What I like about the Moganar, as far as world building
It
goes,
appears that once activated, the unique phazon inside your body overreacts after several seconds. We did not foresee this problem when we gave you the PED, and unknowingly, we put you in grave danger. We are sorry. Please be aware that it will not be possible to counter Dark Samus without the PED. You must be careful in using it. In the
first of all,
meantime,
it is
we will
possible to
continue
cast
investigate this unique phazon.
to Okay, first of all, it is possible to counter Dark Samus without the use of the PED. It's been done once already with the light suit provided by the Luminoff. Effectively, using Dark Samus's power against it is the way to go. But assuming we don't do that, the PED is the next best option. Aside from what happened in Prime. So, how do I want to word this? Going back to Metroid Prime, the Phazon suit was one of the most potent, and if I'm being honest, one of the best received upgrades in the entire trilogy. This upgrade is actually what creates Dark Samus. The energy that was within Samus's suit bonded with the DNA to a degree, or rather replicated the DNA within Samus's suit, the biotech, and created something totally new when it was removed. This is a reincarnation of the Metroid Prime, something that was at one point unstable. And let's be real, probably always has been. Dark Samus had always been hostile and volatile towards Samus because it saw Samus as a threat. And it also liked the space pirates. Partially, I think, because the pirates were easy to manipulate, and partially because I believe that Dark Samus, seeing them attack Samus, there was a belief that they could control the power that was the pirates in and of itself, or at least redirect it towards a common foe. That's at least what I would like to say. As far as the Moganar go, I do like them to a degree. I like what they represent, being the age of science, the pinnacle of what this reptilian race was able to achieve in terms of technology. But I also believe that they did so in a way that could have been better. There was this melding of energy, technology, and stone carvings to create something I'd call it unique as far as the world itself goes. But on top of that, they also have created a means of becoming invisible temporarily. The reptilian race was, for all intents and purposes, highly advanced. But their technology and their creations ended up... Correction. Their technology, their ideals, and their creations all fought against each other in a way. The idea being that at one point or another they would be able to control what was going on. That they would be able to terraform their planet, make it more hospitable, survive with 1 HP in a dream, effectively. And to a degree, they succeeded. The Bryyonians were fantastic in that regard. But their refusal to acknowledge the old ways, their life prior to, well, prior to coming across the Federation, the Chozo, the Luminoth, etc., ended up being a detriment to their species as a whole. I don't believe that this is anything controversial. If it is, I apologize. But to me, it always felt like it was hubris that is the biggest villain in this series. In Metroid Prime, it was the hubris of the space pirates that was the greatest villain. As the space pirates, while strong and could definitely handle one or two interactions, were not exactly able to control what it was that they released upon the world. Their experiments having a 100% death rate, but still seeing their experiments as successful is a terrible idea and terrible use of science as a whole. But yet, other species, when it came down to it, were creatures like the Chozo that sought to create weapons like the Metroids to combat a threat like the X-Parasite, but unknowingly unleashed Metroids to the entire universe because they were bioweapons for all intents and purposes. Hubris is the biggest problem with this universe. Every species has it. Every species has this belief of control. Something that, overall, I don't believe that any of the creatures within should have had in any notable capacity. There's always some unknown that they were trying to sort out. Anyways, if you like what you see, drop a like, leave subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, be good to one another and have a good one.